Welcome to Why I Left, a podcast that explores the Great Resignation. I'm your host, Brian Aquart. Join me as I chronicle real stories from real people about the reasons they decided to leave their jobs during the pandemic and what has happened since. Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of Why I Left. In today's episode, I chat with Leah Phifer. Leah is the founder of Why Work, an employee engagement consulting business that helps individuals define and articulate their relationship to work. Her passion for public service was truly undeniable, but the intense experiences she faced left her feeling broken, disillusioned, and overwhelmed. So, to better understand her changing relationship to work, she immersed herself in research on why people leave their jobs they once loved. Let's go check it out. All right, welcome back. So our guest today is Leah Phifer. With an impressive background in federal government service, including roles with Homeland Security and the FBI, Leah's journey took an unexpected turn after a particularly challenging detail at the southern border that really changed her relationship to work. But this led her to make a pivot of her own and launch Why Work, where she uses Lego Serious Play to facilitate dialogue between employees and employers. Now, drawing on her vast experience in HR and crisis management, she's also formulated a 3-step process to mitigate the largest HR crisis in decades. So I'm really excited for her to share more about that. And so welcome to the show, Leah. How you doing?
Really well. Thanks for having me, Brian.
Absolutely. And so now before we get into, your pivot and some of the work that you're doing now, would love for our audience just to get a chance to know you. And so tell us a little bit about, your upbringing.
Yeah, so I was raised in one of those beautiful towns in northern Minnesota along the Lake Superior shore, just a fantastic area to grow up, but it was a really small town. I think there was about 3,000 people in my town growing up. So I always dreamt of getting out to the big city and experiencing those big city stories I heard so much about. So I applied exclusively to colleges on the East Coast, and I ended up going to the University of Connecticut. And I remember walking into the auditorium on the first day of freshman year and looking around and seeing about 3,000 people in my freshman class. And I thought, wow, there are more people sitting in this room than my entire hometown growing up. So it was a little overwhelming, but it was also very exciting.
No, that's awesome. And you were a public servant for many years. So tell us more about, your personal journey and what led to your work in government service.
Yeah, so in high school, the only language offering that was available was French. So when I went to college, I was determined to study Spanish. I ended up majoring in Spanish at the University of Connecticut and studying abroad for 3 semesters in Spain and France. And then I went back to Spain for 2 years to teach English. So when I came back to Minnesota, it was 2008, the height of the Great Recession. And I had achieved my goal of Spanish fluency, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. So I ended up getting a job in a supervised release program for undocumented immigrants who were awaiting their day in court. I had a caseload of about 80 Spanish-speaking immigrants living in the Minneapolis area, and I helped them navigate their court proceedings. I'd visit them in their homes, check on the kids, make sure that they had arrangements if the court system ultimately denied their application for asylum. And it was a really tough job, Brian, but it was gratifying to shed some light on the complexities of the U.S. immigration system and put it in a language that people could understand. Eventually, though, I wanted to do more. The people that I was working with were in a supervised release program, so they were mostly free to go about their daily lives, go to their jobs, pick up their kids from school. And I wanted to bring my Spanish fluency and my knowledge of immigration law to people who were detained while waiting for their cases to be heard. So I applied to work in an immigration detention center in the metro area, where I spent several years interviewing people who had recently crossed the border, hearing their stories, evaluating any opportunities that they may have had to apply for asylum or a special visa status. And at the time, I was the only person in the detention center who spoke fluent Spanish. So I kept really busy. I was talking to families around the clock, detained immigrants, keeping them apprised of what was going on with their cases and explaining their legal options to them. It was really chaotic, but I enjoyed providing clarity amidst that confusion. The confusion that permeates crises is the hardest thing for us as humans. So I did that for a few years, and I even spent several months down at the border when the number of people crossing the border would get really high. But I got tired of immigration being used as a political football. I got tired of working every day with people who were being used as political pawns. It was just such a draining and heart-wrenching experience. The policies would change constantly depending on who was in charge, and it became so confusing for people that even I couldn't lend any clarity and break through the noise for them. So in 2015, I applied to work at an agency I thought would be less of a political football, and that was the FBI. So that turned out to be another side of crisis management that illuminated a lot of ways that politics has broken our federal policies.
Yeah, no, without a doubt. And what are some of the things you're most proud of in some of the work that you've done?
I'm proud that I stepped into the arena to help from the inside rather than leaving people to just fend for themselves in what is often a complicated and broken federal system. I always advocated for the good in people, and it was more than advocacy a lot of times. I would stake my job and my reputation on it. I remember in 2010, there was a Venezuelan mother that I had worked with for a couple of years, and eventually the court system denied her application for asylum, and they ordered her to return to Venezuela. But her children were eligible to stay here in Minnesota, so she arranged to have them live with her sister. And on her final night here in Minnesota, before her plane left for Venezuela, the power was shut off at her apartment, and the agents couldn't reach her via phone, and they couldn't install a tracking system, and the judge did not believe that she would show up for her plane the next day. So he was going to order her taken back into custody, and I just could not bear the thought of her spending her last night here in jail away from her kids. So I begged the agent in charge at the time to trust me. I just said, please trust me. I have been speaking with her for weeks about wanting to come back and follow the process, be reunited with her children. And I see how dedicated she is to doing this. And the agent told me, all right, if you're wrong about this, the judge is going to be furious and I will not cover for you. I'm basically telling me that I'd be fired or demoted if she did not show up for her plane the next day. So I took full responsibility for it. I don't think I slept a lot that night, but when I showed up at the airport the next morning, she was there. She was hugging her kids. She was telling them she would be back to see them soon. So, Brian, I'm not always proud of all the laws in this country or how they're enforced. It's why I ran for Congress in 2018, but I'm proud that I stepped into the arena to help from the inside.
No, without a doubt. And a part of the show's origins really starts from the pandemic. And so I would love to kind of take you back briefly to that moment in time. We're a few years removed at the time we're recording this now, but let's go back to March of 2020. COVID hits us all. Talk to us a little bit about how the pandemic affected you.
For me, the pandemic, I think the largest way that it affected myself and my husband is that we're part-time caregivers for my husband's father and my grandma, both now in their 80s. And I think the biggest effect that the pandemic had on us was our responsibility to them became more complicated. We're trying to provide care for them while also not getting them sick. We are both fairly healthy people in our late 30s at the time, so we were pretty sure that we'd be okay if we had gotten COVID, but we did not want to be responsible for passing it on to our elderly parents and grandparents. I remember popping a bottle of champagne the day that my husband's father got his COVID vaccine. We knew that we weren't totally out of the woods yet, but it just felt so good to make it to this really big milestone of being able to provide care for them while also not getting them sick.
Oh, definitely. And how did this time really start to impact your relationship with your job?
Well, after my congressional campaign in 2018, I returned to work for the federal government, but I went back to the USDA. I went into human resources rather than return to national security. I was already allowed to work 3 days a week from home with the USDA, so switching to full-time work from home wasn't a big transition. I think, if anything, I just felt really grateful that I was able to work safely from home full-time during that period.
Oh, definitely. And so now in 2021, you had an experience at the southern border that was deeply impactful. I kind of teed it up in the beginning. Tell us more about it and how it really shaped your perspective on work.
Well, many of us slowed down in that first year or so of the pandemic. And I really appreciated that opportunity to slow down and evaluate life and work like so many people. But I'm not someone to slow down for very long. So in the spring of 2021, while I was working in human resources at the USDA, the Biden administration had issued a call for any federal employee from any agency to report to Texas to help with the growing number of unaccompanied minor children that were showing up at the border. And I knew that a lot of the federal volunteers who would answer the call were from agencies like the EPA or Social Security Administration, Department of Labor. I knew they wouldn't have a lot of experience in immigration law or necessarily even speak Spanish. So I felt like I had to go. I felt that I had a unique skill set that could really benefit the situation. And I talked it over with my husband, who was my boyfriend at the time, and we decided that I had to go. And I didn't necessarily want to go. I had done assignments down to the border before, and I knew it was going to be hard. I knew it was going to be hot, and I knew that COVID was far from over. I think I had just gotten my vaccine maybe 2 weeks before I got on a plane to go down to Texas. And to further complicate the matter, my father had passed away 3 days before I got on the plane to go down to Texas. So I was not in a good place emotionally or mentally to provide support to thousands of traumatized children. But who was? I mean, everyone in the entire world was reeling from the pandemic. Everyone was grieving. Everyone was struggling. And I knew I had this unique skill set and I knew these kids needed help. So I went. I arrived at Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas on May 3rd of 2021, and they had just started to build this site where thousands of children would stay while their case managers tried to reach their sponsors in the United States. And these kids showed up on buses in hundreds a day with nothing but a phone number written on their hand or pinned to their shirt. And trying to keep them safe and calm while working around the clock to reach their family, friend, or relative in the US was really hard. At one point, we were caring for over 5,000 children, nearly 5,000 children, all living on an Army base in tents in nearly 100-degree weather, with maybe 200 case managers doing everything they could to track down these children's sponsors in the US. And I have worked in a lot of crisis management situations, Brian, a lot of heartbreaking situations, but this one was different because it involved children, exclusively children. And some of the hardest situations would occur when a case manager would finally reach a child sponsor in the US and the person would say, "I'm sorry, but I can't take this child right now. I have 5 kids living with me who arrived from my home country, plus 2 of my own, and I can't support them." And then this case manager would come to me with tears in their eyes and they would say, "How do I tell this child that they're not going to live with the person who they thought they were coming here to be with? How do I tell them they're not wanted?" And now this case manager, Brian, is not a trained social worker. This case manager is a volunteer from the EPA, a volunteer from the Department of Labor or the Social Security Administration. They were not equipped to have these sort of conversations. So my heart would break for the children, but also for the adults who didn't have the tools or the training to do this incredibly hard job. So we would meet with the child together and explain the situation, and we would do our best, but we were all drowning. And this was a crisis situation that I did not have the tools to provide clarity on. I don't think anybody did.
Wow. That I mean, just listening to it, it just feels like heart wrenching for some of those folks. Obviously the kids, right? But like what then would happen in that case where now they're not going to the sponsor?
We would continue to try to find other options. We would connect with their parents back in their home country and see if there was anyone else that we were able to connect them with, or eventually they would make arrangements to have them return back to their home country.
Oh, wow. Wow. Now, as I've been following, your work, you've mentioned, feeling disconnected and really trying to understand why from a job sense, right? So what were some of the key insights or realizations that you had during your months of research, on why people are leaving their jobs once they left?
So it was interesting timing. So I arrived to Fort Bliss in early May and I returned in August. So after almost 3 months of working 80-hour weeks around the clock in these very demanding conditions with these very vulnerable children, I got back to my work at the USDA and I was mentally checked out. It was August of 2021, and this term didn't quite exist yet, but I was quiet quit. And it had nothing to do with my agency. The USDA is a great place to work, and the work I was doing as an HR specialist was wonderful. But it was just this general disconnect from the purpose of government work. Like, if we as a country, as an international superpower, couldn't protect the most vulnerable population on the planet, children, then what was the point of working for the government? And I was just so disconnected and so disengaged for the first time in 15 years of working for the government. And this all happened to be occurring in August of 21, which was the same month that 4.3 million Americans quit their jobs in what Anthony Klotz termed the Great Resignation.
Right.
And now you know that he actually had come up with that term in May of that year.
Yeah.
But August was when we really started to see it show up in the jobs numbers and in the media. So I was really fascinated as to why I was feeling this disconnect and this disillusionment with my job at the same time that millions of other Americans were feeling it. And I really wanted to find out what we had in common. What was this common denominator? Was it some sort of like collective crisis response? Were we all just collectively burned out? And it really sent me down this rabbit hole of studying people's relationships to their jobs.
And you know what's great? You and I were having moments at the same time for different reasons, right? But still, like I was also very fascinated by this. And you know, Anthony actually opened up season 2 for me because I wanted to better understand why people were leaving their jobs as well. Because you know, one of the things that you know, so you during the pandemic were obviously very involved in that situation on the southern border. I was just very involved in some of the COVID efforts that are happening out here on the East Coast. And so it's so funny how, like, when you and I met and I heard your initial story, now people are probably getting like oh, he was probably nerding out like, oh, he's got to speak to Leah because when I saw you, I was like, oh, this is perfect because it is so fascinating, you know? You know, looking back on during that pandemic time, what's one thing you think you would have done differently?
I think, and I suspect that a lot of people feel this same way. Perhaps you do, Brian. I would have better prepared emotionally for the crisis situation that I found myself in. You know, for me, it was being down at the border at Fort Bliss, but for you, it was being intricately involved in the crisis response to COVID. And for so many other people, they were also involved in that in one way or the other. And I don't know if any of us really had the tools and the vocabulary to describe what we were feeling, but if I could have better prepared emotionally for those 3 months down at Fort Bliss, I don't know that I could have improved the situation for the kids. That was ultimately, you know, really, really above my pay grade coming from the administration level. But I think that I could have dealt better with the ramifications afterwards.
You know, that's a great point, right? And something, if I'm being honest with myself, I don't know if I fully took the time to process either, that I was not prepared for what was about to occur in that, you know, for us it was March 13th, 14th, right? I wasn't prepared for what was about to happen then. And so you're absolutely right. And I think some of the folks, you know, as I continue the show, what's good about, as you know, we're moving further away from that, people have had time to digest and process, and they're thinking about that. And those are a lot of the things that I'm hearing now. So it's good that, you know, we've given ourselves that. But I truly agree that during that time, I would have loved to prepare better emotionally for what was about to occur. So that's such a great point. You know,
And what might be interesting for your listeners, because I see a lot of lack of education around this as well, but what is burnout? Everyone uses the word burnout as sort of this ubiquitous term to describe this general feeling of energy depletion. But what I learned when I came back from Fort Bliss after I went down that rabbit hole of trying to understand what was going on with me and millions of Americans is burnout is comprised of 3 components. It's cynicism, inefficacy, and exhaustion, both emotional and physical. Now, exhaustion, emotional and physical, is fairly straightforward. Emotional exhaustion is when you feel a distance between yourself and the people you're working with. You see them not as humans, but more as just chores, another thing on your to-do list. But then cynicism is when you fail to see meaning and progress in your work, and inefficacy is when you lack the tools to do your job well. And true burnout is comprised of all 3 of those elements, and that's a big part of the work I do now, is helping to educate people on the components of burnout so that they can get to the right solution for it.
no, I love that. I absolutely love that. You know, and so look, after being in public service for about 15 years, you decide to resign in May of 2022. So ultimately, why did you leave your job?
Ultimately, I had discovered how to recognize and alleviate burnout in myself, and I felt compelled to tell others. I needed I needed to shout it from the rooftops. Everything that I had read online when trying to understand why I was so disconnected from my work pointed to rest or quitting your job as the only solution to burnout, or quiet quitting your job, or now I think the term is lazy girl jobs. None of these solutions are real solutions to burnout. The only real solution to burnout is employee engagement. And that's why I call one of my most in-demand workshops is Busting Burnout Myths, because the myths about burnout online are rampant. And that's why we're seeing very little progress being made in this area.
And so how did it feel to like make this decision? And really what was kind of the response that you got from others that you told?
I was nervous to leave a 15-year career in federal government that had a steady paycheck and good benefits. I had a master's of public policy. I had run for Congress. I worked at an embassy in Peru and was on the border for many, many months, worked for the FBI. So I kind of worried at some level that I wouldn't know who I am if I wasn't a public servant. But leadership at my agency was very supportive. They had given me a public service award for the work that I had done at the border. They had invited me to speak at a departmental town hall about it. They knew what I'd been through to the extent that anyone who wasn't there can really know. And they were also in the midst of combating the bird flu themselves. So they were pretty preoccupied with their own crisis. So they were supportive and focused on the crisis that they were enmeshed in as well.
Oh, that's great. And now since you left, you started this company, Why Work, right? And so tell us about your decision to start the company and how does it help people, maybe even organizations, define and articulate their relationship to work?
Yeah, so with the blessings of the ethics committee at the USDA, I had launched my business about 6 months before I ended up leaving the USDA. I launched in January of 2022, and those first 6 months were so busy, and I was getting so many client requests for workshops on burnout and employee engagement and how to help people feel reconnected to their work that I ended up having to leave the USDA in May of that year. And it's been wonderful ever since. I love helping people focus on what they need truly to thrive at work. And the answers are unique to everyone, but they fall into three definitive elements. And the three elements of employee engagement are satisfaction, significance, and connection. Satisfaction is a lot of the things that we see in the media. They're things like increasing wages, benefits, your work environment, remote, hybrid, things that your organization mostly controls. I call those the one-way factors of employee engagement. And if you're satisfied with those elements of your job, you can be considered a satisfied employee. But to be an engaged employee, you need the other two elements of connection and significance. Connection is feeling a connection to the people that you work with, as well as the mission of your organization. And significance is seeing meaning and progress in your work, which is defined a little bit differently by everyone. So what I really focus on doing is allowing people in my workshops to have hands-on time, really to focus on how they find significance in their work. Brian, when you're leaving for work in the morning or you're getting ready to log into your computer, what's one thing you look forward to doing? Or what is one thing that people always come to you for advice on? Really helping people identify the things they do on a daily basis with ease, excellence, and enjoyment. And I find that that's really helped people reconnect with the elements of their job they really enjoy.
No, I love that. So you mean to tell me that Pizza Fridays are not really increasing employee engagement? Is that what you're saying?
Hey, I mean, if that increases your connection to your colleagues you're sharing pizza with, maybe. But I think pizza alone is not going to solve our disengagement problems.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. Now one of the things I was so interested to learn more about in preparing for this discussion was, you incorporating Lego serious play in your work. And so can you explain, how these methods really help facilitate dialogue and improve that understanding between, companies and the folks who work for them?
Absolutely. So first off, Lego Serious Play is a 30-year-old methodology that was created by the Lego Group in the early 90s. And it's been used by organizations from NASA to the U.S. Naval Warfare Center, Google, Visa, MasterCard, just incredible organizations all around the globe. And the reason I use it is because employee engagement as a field has traditionally relied on one single research methodology, and that is surveys. I'm sure, Brian, you have probably at some point in your life received an employee satisfaction survey or engagement survey. A lot of organizations do them annually. And, you click a few buttons, you rate yourself and how you're feeling about your job on the Likert scale. And most people who've taken these surveys will agree that they don't move the needle on anything. There's usually very little change that happens at the organization after taking these surveys, and then less and less people participate in them every year. So I'm not knocking surveys. There is a place in research methodology for surveys. Gallup has used them for 30 years to contribute to their Global State of the Workforce report. But many organizations are realizing that surveys are not moving the needle on employee engagement. So some places have turned to interviews. You may have heard the term stay interviews.
Right.
Stay interviews are also a decent way of understanding if your employees are engaged or not, but they're also not perfect because both interviews and surveys rely on just using one part of our brain, the part of our brain that controls our speaking, writing, reading, and listening skills. And if we truly want to get into an entrenched problem, find solutions to something that has remained stagnant for 30 years, like employee engagement levels, we need to get out of those parts of our brain and into the parts of our brain we used to learn as children, when we just learned with abandon, where we were just diving in and learning so fast about ourselves and the world around us. And to do that, we have to activate the hand-mind connection. And that's why I love Lego Serious Play. Because instead of asking someone, hey, Brian, what is it that you like about your job? Write me a 10,000 word essay on it. That may not be the best method for you to convey what you enjoy about your job. But if I hand you some Legos and I say, hey, Brian, tell me what brings you joy in your work. Build it for me. That might trigger something in your brain that will help you connect with the elements of your job that truly bring you joy.
I love that. And, one of the things you mentioned too, like around engagement and obviously, enhancing communication at work, what are maybe 3 barriers that you've noticed that really prevent folks from really having that effective communication between either team members, leaders, or even, a broader scale?
So I think there are 3 primary barriers to effective communication in the workplace, and it's really the who, the what, and the how. The who involves the people. We often have these internalized barriers that might not really exist outside of our minds, but we may not want to ask for something because the last time we asked for it, our boss turned us down, or maybe it wasn't even the same boss we have now, but we still have that internalized rejection, and it really prevents us from speaking up. There may be things going on in your relationship with your management or leadership that prevent you from speaking up. So a lot of times it's the people involved in the communication that can be a barrier to it. And then the what is the specific self-knowledge. So a lot of times we aren't even able to accurately articulate what it is that we need to thrive at work. If I ask you in the course of a stay interview, Brian, what do you need to stay at your job? Many people are going to resort to those things that are front of mind. They're going to say, I need a raise, or I need a better office, things that kind of fall into that satisfaction category. But if I give you Legos and I ask you to build what you need to thrive at your job, you might find yourself building a table full of coworkers, other minifigs, sharing pizza or chatting with one another. And afterwards, you'll reflect on that and think, actually, what I need to thrive is more connection to my colleagues or more connection to my mission. So helping people articulate the what, the self-knowledge of what they really need to thrive at work, is also another big barrier to communication. And then finally, the how we communicate. A lot of times we only communicate what we need via a survey, or maybe it's a 15-minute check-in with our boss, but we really need to break down those barriers to be able to more deeply communicate in ways that are effective in transmitting what we need to thrive.
I like that. We talked earlier about this HR crisis that we've all been going through, and you have this 3-step process that you've formulated to really help mitigate this. So tell us about what that process is and how you implement it now.
So the process is collection, communication, and collaboration. And the collection portion really focuses on collecting the data around employee engagement, which is something that a lot of organizations do. Gallup being the premier research organization on employee engagement, other places like Deloitte, Pricewater Clearinghouse, BCG, the three big ones, all do a lot of work on collecting data around employee engagement. But it's not enough to just collect the data. We have to actually move the needle. And moving the needle includes communicating. So once that data is collected, how do we talk about it? Do we just talk about it behind closed doors at leadership or board meetings and then never actually go out into the workforce to communicate with people about what they need to thrive at work? So that next step of communication is incredibly important. And then the third step is collaboration. I view employee engagement as a two-way street. Gallup has found that 70% of a team's engagement levels are attributable to their management. I'm not discounting the role of leadership in really promoting employee engagement, but we as employees also have a role to play. We need to identify what it is we need to thrive at work and clearly communicate that, and then collaborate with our leadership to craft our jobs to help ensure we're spending at least 20% of our days doing activities that light us up, that engage us. And that 20% is not just a figure I pulled out of thin air. The Mayo Clinic did a study in 2019 to understand why some physicians experience burnout at higher rates than others. And what they found is that physicians who spend at least 20% of their day doing activities that energize them, that light them up, they experience burnout at far lesser levels than those who don't reach that 20% threshold. So it's really important that you craft your job to make sure you're spending 20% of your day on activities that light you up.
No, without a doubt. And you know what I think that's happening in this space now too is that employees are, you mentioned it being a two-way street, but employees are also becoming more comfortable in sharing that information with their direct managers. And I think that is also crucial. Having been in the HR space before previously, that's always been helpful because it can't just be top down, right? It can't just be top down. And folks, if they have a complaint or an issue about something, sometimes they may not feel comfortable raising that. But I've seen over the years that now it's becoming, a bit more or less taboo, I should say.
Yeah, and bringing forth solutions. So it's
Yeah.
not just, hey, I dislike this part of my job, fix it for me. It's, I'm not crazy about this part of my job. It really drains my energy. How about we try to incorporate more of this part of my job, the part that energizes me, lights me up, and let's focus on getting more of those activities worked into my job description.
Yeah, absolutely. So look, a lot of big changes have happened for you these past few years. What do you think you have learned most about yourself throughout this entire process?
I'd say that I have learned to redefine ambition. Like many people, I was living an incredibly fast paced and traditionally ambitious lifestyle before COVID. I was working in crisis management, running for Congress, doing a lot of traditionally ambitious things. But then the pandemic hit, and many of us were forced to slow down, myself included. And for me, that slow period lasted about 14 months before I left for the border and came home and launched my own business. And I will say that being a business owner is demanding. I'm sure you understand that. But I did take those 14 months in which the world kind of slowed down for me. And I'm trying to carry over some of that intentionality into my day-to-day life now, carving out time for my friends, my husband, my dog that we adopted during the pandemic. And carving out that dedicated time for myself is just as ambitious as working 24/7 in an incident command center or running for office.
I absolutely love that you mentioned that because as I've, navigated, the show, launching it and all of those things, obviously it started with obviously why people are leaving their jobs, right? And I didn't know which route it was going to go. It was never about bashing employers or doing all those things. It was really about the people and the decisions that they made. But what I've come to learn is that over these past few years, people are doing exactly what you just said. We never get a chance to slow down. And will we rarely have we or will we ever again experience like this one thing in time that we're all kind of it's touching us in some way that we're all different now. And everybody's in one way or another, everybody has changed because of this. So kudos to you for one being intentional, right? Because I also I'm trying to do the same in my own life, right? But
Yeah.
but that's really this, as I've been doing this now, that's really the story of the show. Yeah, it's why I left, don't get me wrong. But it's really about people figuring out life for themselves, life and work. And that's been a beautiful story. So I appreciate you mentioning that. And, one part of the show I always like to really get to is really around advice, because folks who are listening, everyone's at a different stage, and whether they're maybe looking to leave or trying to find ways to find more fulfillment and purpose in their lives. And so when I think about maybe someone who is feeling disconnected or even disengaged from their work, but is really, unsure how to address it, what advice would you give to them?
Try Lego Serious Play. Really, I mean, really, grab some Legos or any materials that you can build with and ask yourself, what do I need to feel more fulfilled at work? And then start to build your answer. Don't have a meeting with yourself about it. Don't plan out what you're going to build. Just start picking up the pieces and putting them together. And you will find that you're surprised by what you build. And if you really want to complete the process, find someone to describe your build to. It can be a friend, a partner, a colleague, and have them listen to the way you describe your build and have them write down one thing they saw in your build and one thing they heard as you described it. You'll be very surprised by what you discover when you get out of that traditional part of your brain and you get back into your hands and learning with your hands.
Like that. And just in case someone does do that, which Lego kit should they use to get to start figuring this out? Anything?
Yep. That's the beautiful part of Lego Serious Play. Any Legos will work.
Okay. All right. Good to know. Good to know. The other piece too is I happen to notice you gave a keynote address called "Why Work Isn't Working for Us Anymore." And so, what key points or insights did you share with your former colleagues? I think this was at Homeland, right? But what did you share with them that other companies could really learn from?
I shared Lego Serious Play with them.
Okay.
Seriously, it was 400 crisis management professionals at the Governor's Homeland Security and Emergency Management Conference here this spring in Minnesota, working with Legos to help build what a good day at work looks like to them. Helping them reconnect after a very stressful few years was incredibly gratifying. We worked together to discuss burnout. We worked together to discuss the parts of our jobs that light us up, the reasons we got into this field to begin with. It was a 2-hour keynote, so it provided ample time to both talk and work with our hands. But it was an incredibly wonderful experience to see these firefighters and EMTs and folks who have incredibly demanding jobs using Legos to reconnect with what they once loved about their positions.
I'm sure there was a lot of laughter in the room too.
Oh, it was so great. It was really great.
That's amazing. That's awesome. And so how do you envision, the future of work, and how can organizations really adapt to some of these changing needs and expectations for their employees? One that really comes top of mind is remote work and flexibility, right? But so how do you envision kind of what's next in the future of work?
I see organizations as really needing to build in time for self-reflections for their employees. I mean, the cat's out of the bag, Brian. We are all rethinking our relationships to work. That is evident in what is going on with the media, social media, podcasts. We are all thinking about this. We are all talking about it. The only place that we're not really having these conversations about our relationships to work is at work. So what I do is I come into organizations with my self-reflection practices, with my Legos, and I help people reflect within a framework on what they need to thrive at work and then communicate that to their leadership. So organizations are going to need to set aside that dedicated time for employees to engage in that sort of self-reflection because their employees are doing it anyway. And if you can do it within the framework of the organization, you'll find that people can identify elements currently in their jobs that they can connect with and then amplify. And you'll see lower turnover, you'll see higher productivity, and just generally more engaged employees.
Love that. And what do you hope to achieve long term through Why Work? And how do you see it making this positive, lasting impact on folks?
So my really audacious goal with Why Work is to completely redefine work. work. The tagline of my business is the world of work has changed forever, so now let's change it for good. And what we
Ooh,
really need to do is take these changes from the past 3 years, all the ways that people are self reflecting and changing their relationships to work, and then use those changes to redesign work itself, to craft your job in a way that really amplifies the things that light you up, the skills that you have, the things that you do with ease, excellence, and enjoyment. And to some leaders, this might sound like you're crafting individual position descriptions for every person, but you're really not. You're harnessing their unique skills and interests in support of the organizational mission. And you'll find that people are so much more productive when they get to do what they do best.
absolutely. And, before I kind of get to my last question, there was one thing that we talked about in our intro call, and you mentioned a couple times here around burnout, and it's a huge, huge topic of the day. But I'd love for you to shed light on something that's being called this human energy crisis, right? And what is that, and how can we potentially mitigate it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember you and I talking about this. So, the human energy crisis is different than burnout because burnout is typically something that you experience over a finite amount of time. The human energy crisis is more akin to climate change. So, just like we've seen glaciers melting and sea levels rising and these intensified swings in temperature and weather events, and we're seeing all these changes on an environmental level, we're also seeing on a human level a crisis of global mental health. We're demanding too much of ourselves and of the planet, and it's depleting the Earth's resources as well as our most precious human resource, which is our energy. And burnout can be alleviated by focusing on solutions to the three elements of burnout: cynicism, inefficacy, and exhaustion. But the human energy crisis is only going to be alleviated if we undergo a wholesale redesign of the way that we work and live.
That's going to be huge. And I think, I'll put some information in the show notes about that, because I think that's a whole topic in and of itself, right? That's huge. And, one of the things I'm loving to do for season 3 is really tee up for my guests. What is one question that you have for me that I could potentially answer?
I love this. So, this is a question I ask a lot of people, but I'm particularly interested in your response because you are an accomplished, ambitious individual who may also contend with external systemic issues that I might not experience. So, my question is, when you're faced with both of these internal and external pressures, how do you protect your energy, Brian?
Great question. So there are one of the things that's helped me out is one, I am very laser focused on things, right? And I try not to allow some of the outside pressures dictate how I know I should be navigating an issue or a problem or whatever the case may be. And I think that's been helpful for me because at times there have been, I've kind of quote unquote walked alone, if you will, in a variety of settings. And I think having to do that, whether truthfully whether healthy or not, what it's allowed me to be comfortable with is knowing what I can do and knowing what I can't or shouldn't be doing, right?
Mm.
And so being in a space where, and variety of whether it could be socioeconomic or racial or whatever, all the things. What I know is that I was just actually talking with somebody about this online. If I say I'm going to do something, and even if it's going to be hard, I don't give myself an out to not do it, right? And so
Mm.
no matter what comes from me or comes to me, I'm going to get that done, right? And that's going to could potentially take time. It's obviously going to take effort, but more importantly, it needs my focus. And if I said I'm going to do it, then I know I'm going to be focused on it. And so to kind of answer your question, how I deal with some of those pressures is really not taking my eye off the ball, right?
Mm.
If I had an idea for, let's just use the show as an example. I think I'm going to launch a show. You know what? I should do it, right? I want to do it now because it's different than I should or I think or
Yeah.
no, I want to or I'm going to launch a show. Okay, perfect. How do we make it happen? And then you just figure it out. Because I'll tell you, when I launched this thing, I was in a very high profile type of role, And, my boss was actually the first person I told about the show because we had some really good conversations about it. But it was, well, where do you find time to do this? And I was like, you put your mind to something, you make time to do it. And, it's not going to be perfect, right? I don't have 100,000 followers or anything like that. But the message that I'm getting out, I'm proud of that. And so I never took my eye and I never take my eye off the ball. So it's a great question. I appreciate you asking that.
Yeah, it sounds like you've identified what gives you energy and you've really committed to doing those things because the things that you put your mind to do are the ones that fill you up, that energize you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I love that. And I actually love the fact that this part is a part of the show now because it now gets me a chance to think about some of the things. I never know what's coming, by the way. I tell that to my audience. I never know the questions that are coming. So this is truthfully off the cuff, but I love to just, get a chance to process and think about some of these things that my guests ask. So Leah, this was a great conversation. I loved hearing your story. So much, so many similarities and kind of why we are doing some of the things that we're doing now. So I'm glad that you and I got connected and would love for you to share where our listeners can support some of the work that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. You can visit my website. It's just www.y-work.org. You can check out my page dedicated to Lego Serious Play, and you can follow on Facebook and LinkedIn and Instagram as well. So I hope that you'll find some tidbits that are of use to both you and your listeners there.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for that info. I'll make sure I share that in our show notes. And look, that'll do it for today's episode. I want to again thank Leah Phifer for joining us today. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, Leah.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks again for listening to Why I Left. Be sure to join us next time for more stories from the Great Resignation. Visit us at www.whyileft.co. That's whyileft.co. And subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.